Hello and welcome to the final Ada Lovelace Day 2021 webinar. If you have watched our other webinars, you'll know that this is our 13th celebration of women in science, technology, engineering and maths. And we are delighted to have partnered with the Arthur C. Clarke Award to bring you today's discussion about hypersleep and whether we really will one day be able to put humans into a state of suspended animation. But before we go on with that, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, without whom this webinar would literally not be possible. So I'd like to say thank you to Red Hat, SUSE, Xero, Jane Street, the IET, Vonage, School Dash, Digital Science, G Research, Software Impacts, the Information Lab, and Work 180 for their support this year. So during today's webinar, if you have any questions, you can ask in either the Facebook or the YouTube chat. We would love to hear from you. And with that, I would like to hand you over to our moderator for this evening, Anne Charnock.
Hello. Hello, I'm delighted to chair this discussion with three eminent scientists in the field of sleep, hibernation and torpor. And before we do our introductions, I thought perhaps I should just brief you a little bit about hypersleep, because some of you might be wondering, what is it? And it's sometimes referred to as suspended animation. In fact, it's a fiction created by science fiction writers, which allows us to create stories about astronauts venturing to distant planets and distant galaxies. And these stories might vaguely suggest that the astronauts enter a state of mild hypothermia, but it's very light on detail. So hypersleep, what's the point of it? The reason we need it in science fiction is that we need to avoid the problems of, first of all, boredom on the journeys lasting months or even years. And equally important, hypersleep would allow constructors to build smaller, lighter spacecraft that can travel faster, because the craft would have much lower payload, because you're not having to carry all that food and the gubbins needed by a fully conscious, fully awake crew. So in other words, hypersleep is what we call a MacGuffin. It doesn't exist, but it's a necessary device for our science fictional plots. So perhaps today in this panel, we could think about whether fiction could become fact and what we can learn by studying animals that hibernate. So if we just briefly introduce ourselves, and as I've got the floor, I'll start. So my name's Anne Charnock, and I was a science journalist for New Scientist and The Guardian in a previous career. I now write fiction. I've written 4 novels, and my novel Dreams Before the Start of Time, that won the Arthur C. Clarke Award for science fiction in 2018. And in that novel, I imagine a future where people use artificial wombs to gestate embryos, rather than a person carrying a pregnancy. And in a weird parallel to what we're talking about this evening, maybe the astronaut in his sleep plops, in their sleep pod, may be akin to an embryo, and it's floating in its artificial womb. Who knows? So perhaps I can invite now Dr. Anusha Shankar to introduce herself, perhaps mention the inspiration for her research.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Anne. My name is Anusha. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I study hummingbirds and how they save energy at night by using a daily version of hibernation, which we call daily torpor. And they're able to save maybe 90% of their energy sometimes if they use torpor compared to normally being asleep. And I'm studying how they do it, like what's happening in their liver and their heart and their brain, what's going on, what processes are still active versus not, to allow them to save so much energy. And it's just fascinating to me. How can you get down to 10 degrees Celsius or 40 Fahrenheit at night and then warm back up and go about your day as if nothing happened without any heart malfunctioning, any brain damage. It's just incredible to me. And that's my inspiration.
Great, thanks, Anusha. And Professor Gina Poe, perhaps you'd like to go now.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Gina Poe. I'm at UCLA. I'm a professor in integrative biology and physiology, and I've been studying sleep for almost 30 years. I'm really interested because we don't really know the function or functions of sleep, although in the last 30 or 50 years, we've come across a lot of things that can happen only during sleep and not during wakefulness. While during wakefulness, there's some things that can only be done, like eating, and getting rid of waste and procreating. During sleep, there are other things that are essential for life, like consolidating the things we've learned, or clearing away the waste in between our brain cells, and growing, which happens with a big burst of growth hormone during sleep. So I'm just fascinated by the things that can happen during sleep, and my research concentrates on what happens to learning and memory while we sleep and dream.
Thanks, Gina. And Professor Kelly Drew, over to you.
Hi. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the organizers. This is really a lot of fun to talk about this concept. I have studied hibernation for nearly 30 years. My background is in just basic biomedical science and neuroscience, neurochemistry, and my inspiration was really about consciousness. I never really had an opportunity to study it. But then I was introduced to hibernation by a colleague. So I'm at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I grew up in Fairbanks and came back to Fairbanks after I had finished my training, and was handed this hibernating ground squirrel. And I'd never seen anything like it. It's a state of consciousness that we really can't appreciate. And not to mention that the animal I was holding was near 0 degrees Celsius, and is known to go even colder than that. So they're just absolutely amazing. And because my background is in biomedical sciences, I've always been interested in how we can translate this for medical applications. And one of them is a hypersleep-like phenomenon, possibly short-term for neurocritical care and long-term for space travel. And why not?
Thanks, Kelly. Perhaps I could ask Gina. You touched on there about what's happening when humans sleep. What's the essential purpose of sleep, and is there anything that we can learn for the purposes of hypersleep from sleep disorders?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. There are several essential functions of sleep. One is to clean up the mess that we make during wakefulness in our brains and elsewhere. So we injure muscles, and we also unfold proteins and lots of new information that needs to be put away. And that happens only during sleep. So it's another time when we are resetting our metabolism. Our metabolism drops, especially in slow wave sleep. And we do find our metabolism goes haywire if we sleep deprive ourselves. So it's really an important time for resetting metabolism. It's a time when we are integrating new information into our brains. And that happens through the transition to REM sleep and during REM sleep when we're dreaming really vividly and putting new things together. We're gaining insights through sleep. And we know much of this because of sleep disorders like insomnia or obstructive sleep apnea, which a lot of people have, where people don't sleep very well at all. And the problems that happen, the related problems that happen, we can then study in animals to see if really it's causal versus just correlated. Yeah, so one of the things that really interested me, sorry, I just want to see one more thing. The first thing that interested me in sleep was a lecture by Craig Heller at Stanford. Yeah, he showed us that during rapid eye movement sleep, this dream state, we stop thermoregulating all of our thermoregulatory mechanisms just stop, and our body drifts in the direction of whatever the temperature of the room is. So he said, "Why is that?" Nobody knew. I said, "That's interesting." And not but a year later, I was in it.
So you think that sleep disorders are related in some way to body temperature and body temperature regulation?
It could be. I would love for Kelly to chime in on this too. Yeah, one of the things that we do when we're falling asleep is our body temperature lowers a bit, and that seems to be an important part of falling asleep. So if that doesn't happen because of the environment or something going on in our bodies, it's much harder to fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. It's just really interesting when you look at hibernation that it is all about energy conservation. So like sleep, it's also connected to metabolism. And I think that it enhances the role of temperature on what we see in sleep as well. So animals have to go through slow wave sleep to enter hibernation. And slow wave sleep, as they lower their body temperature, the amplitude of the EEG gets smaller and smaller, which is interesting because it's slow wave sleep that they enter hibernation, but it's REM sleep when they lose their thermoregulation. So those two don't really go hand in hand. I don't understand it.
Yeah.
But because onset of hibernation is really regulated by decreasing the thermostat in thermoregulation.
This is probably a good time at which to bring in Anusha, because I'd like to know what is so special about hummingbirds in terms of their high energy needs during their waking hours and the way in which they conserve energy at night. If you could explain about that, I think that would really cast a lot of light.
Yeah, I think mammal torpor and hibernation have been studied for a while, and there's a lot we don't know for sure, but we know even less in birds. There are only 3 groups of birds that could use torpor and lower their daily torpor and lower their body temperature by more than 20 degrees Celsius, and hummingbirds are one of those groups. And we think they have to do this because they're so small, but there are pretty big birds that can use daily torpor as well. But hummingbirds have among the highest metabolisms of animals with a backbone, of vertebrates. And if they used energy that quickly all night, every night, sometimes they wouldn't make it to the next morning because they don't store very much fat, unlike long-term hibernating mammals might. And so they use daily torpor to save a bunch of energy by using it for maybe 5 hours, 8 hours, depends on the night length. And then they can warm back up at the end of the night and go about their daily activities without an energy deficit, kind of. It's still incredible that they do it.
I mean, do you think, Anusha, that some hummingbirds kind of fail and they actually die during the night because they don't quite get it right?
It could happen. I think there are lots of, I get emails from people who find hummingbirds at their feeders and they're like, I don't know if it's dead or if it's in torpor. I tried to warm it up, and sometimes they get warmed up and go about their day, so they were probably in torpor, and at other times they can't. So it does happen. I think that maybe they miscalculate, or it's a different temperature than they expected it to be, or they didn't store enough energy in the beginning of the night and they kind of panicked and went into torpor or something. That's anthropomorphizing, but yeah, I think it happens.
I mean, do you think, could you, Anusha, just clarify then what is the difference between hibernation and torpor?
Yeah, so torpor is kind of a broader term, and hibernation is a type of torpor, which it depends on the duration that the animal uses it for. So daily torpor happens overnight, and hibernation can be multi-day or multi-week torpor bouts.
So really what people usually think of hibernation is hibernation.
Yes.
Is several months or several weeks.
Usually in multiple weeks, like if an animal is hibernating for 8 months, like the Arctic ground squirrels that Kelly studies, they usually come out of hibernation for some time at least, sleep and then go back into hibernation, or do something active and then go back into hibernation. So they
Okay.
can't stay in solidly deep at that low metabolic state for many months at a time, it seems like.
Perhaps Kelly could now talk about these Arctic ground squirrels that have taken up so much of your research life, and other animals. They all seem to hibernate differently, but what is special about the Arctic ground squirrel?
I've heard them described as the Olympic sleeper of the North, but they're robust hibernators because largely, I'm sure, because of the environment they've evolved in. So they hibernate for a longer total season. Their body temperature is famous for being able to go below freezing. And then those bouts that Anusha referred to are longer than other species. So they're generally about 3 weeks long. And then they'll pop up for 12 to 24 hours and go back down. So they're just everything we know about hibernation. They're one of the more extreme examples. Yeah, but they're robust hibernators midwinter. They're very difficult to wake up from hibernation, and they just have a really strong drive to hibernate.
And have you studied other animals as well as these?
So others here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks have studied black bear. They're a really interesting model, a little more difficult to work with. But they are so interesting because they're similar in size to humans. And it's interesting that they show significant metabolic suppression. So the Arctic ground squirrel will suppress their metabolic rate down to about 2% of basal metabolic rate. And their body temperature goes down to ambient, or down to about 0. The black bear will suppress its metabolic rate by about 75%, but its body temperature only goes down to about 30 C. And so it's considered sort of warm temperature metabolic suppression, or warm temperature torpor. And in fact, even after they warm up in the spring, their body temperature can be back to normal around 37 C, but they still have 50% suppression of metabolism. So they are really interesting, particularly when we talk about moving into humans, because both the limit of their cooling is more in the range that humans can tolerate, and the metabolic savings is still significant. So bears are really interesting.
And these different animals, then, when they go through hibernation, what do they suffer as a result? What can go wrong for them?
That's the magic of it. They don't suffer anything. There is one study that shows ground squirrels from spring to summer after hibernating compared to animals that don't hibernate as much because they're kept at a warm temperature. They lose some memories. So that is one thing that maybe needs further investigation. They lose some types and not others types of memories. But for the most part, hibernation in itself is really very restorative. So these animals, they double their body weight before they go into hibernation, and they wake up fit and trim. They don't lose their muscle mass. They lose their fat. But even with the brain, whether there's regeneration or whether they just resist any injury is still, I'd probably both play a role. But, when they're hibernating, they virtually have no blood flow, and yet their brain doesn't suffer. And then they have reperfusion when they rewarm, and their brain doesn't suffer.
That's incredible.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And,
I was going to say, one of the functions of sleep is to sort of restore our synaptic connections. And maybe that's why hibernating animals once in a while come back up to sleep, because they need to, I don't know what, check on their synapses and make sure things stay alive and connected. It's interesting because I think of hibernation sort of and hypersleep maybe as going into a cooler, right? And kind of like storing meat, we keep it in the freezer or a cooler to keep it fresh. And so if you're talking about hypersleep for people traveling through space, maybe you're seizing the activity of the enzymes that would break down our tissues, and that's all well and good, but it doesn't work perfectly, right? I mean, you can't freeze meat forever. You can't.
So another thing about the Arctic ground squirrels that we've seen is that there is muscle protein breakdown during torpor, but those nitrogen atoms that are generated are recycled back into both essential and non-essential amino acids.
Wow. During that time?
Yeah, during that time. Well, it's mostly during arousal, then during those little interbout arousals that the nitrogen gets recycled into amino acids. And during that long-term torpor, there is muscle breakdown to some degree. So
could I at this point bring in something I've been reading about a design consultancy called Spaceworks, which won a NASA contract to design, not to build, but to design a crew module, which would take a crew of six astronauts, all of whom would be kept in torpor through cooling in some way for the entire 6 to 9 months of a Mars journey. And I believe, Kelly, that you were involved with that Spaceworks design. Could you tell us about the nature of your involvement with that?
So there was a committee, a group that we met several times to talk about concept, and it was a lot of fun, really a lot of fun to think about it. But the people in the group, there were 2 critical care clinicians, physicians, an engineer, an astronaut, and then a couple of engineers from Spaceworks. And so the current state of the art is definitely taken from emergency medicine and critical care, where cooling is standard of care, for example, after cardiac arrest. It protects the brain from further injury. And so the clinicians had a very invasive approach, like you would do when you're trying to, save somebody that's going to die. And I had more of a naturalist approach, looking at what the animals do. And so we came to kind of a compromise in some of the thought, but so we have a lot to learn about how hibernating animals don't need to eat and what they do with their waste, and all these things that make long-term torpor somewhat complicated, so yeah, so it was fun, though. It was really a lot of fun to talk about it. And one of the concepts that did come out is there was a need for the astronauts to be able to wake up quickly if they needed to in case of an emergency. And so like bears, they sort of wax and wane through their body temperature. And so if you had astronauts on, out of sync, so some were always near the top of the body temperature curve where they could quickly warm up, then we thought that might work.
That's interesting. I was wondering, sorry, just for circadian rhythms, that's something that, helps us push us toward wakefulness at some times of day and others. So you're thinking perhaps that if you could change and invert the circadian cycle, because I read anyway that during hibernation, also the circadian system in some animals sort of freezes in the spot where it's ready to wake up the animal. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's interesting with the Arctic ground squirrel. Clearly, there is no rhythm when they're in torpor. Yeah, if they're and they are ready to wake up when the time is right, whatever tells them that time is right. But yeah, the circadian rhythm plays a role in when they go into torpor as well, because they need to sleep to go into torpor.
I think there's a few comments coming up in the chat room, and I'm just wondering a couple of things. What would it actually feel like for an astronaut going into hypersleep? I mean, would they be in a dream state for the duration of 2 months, 6 months, or would it be almost like a mini death? And coupled with that, when you wake up, have you lost some memories? Can you just kind of just imagine for a moment what it might be like? Perhaps Gina, you could start us off?
I would love to. So one of the things that happens in hibernation is, and I'm not sure about torpor, Anusha, you could tell me whether this is true, but in order to save that much energy, 98% of the energy, the brain actually sort of disconnects all the neurons, not all of them, but 98% or over 90%, they disconnect from one another because it is in the talking to one another that costs a lot of energy. So they retract synapses and they stand back. So I would imagine that there wouldn't be dreams if that were the case. If hypersleep were more like hibernation, I would imagine there would be pretty much nothing going on. And you would have to wake up to become conscious again. And it's incredible to me that you are the same person, that a bear can remember who their mate is and all of that through hibernation. So you imagine that perhaps memories are not necessarily stored in the connection between neurons, but in the chemical signature that gets transferred between neurons when you're learning. And then when it retracts, the synapse retracts, what may happen, although no one's ever studied it, it's hard to study, is that those same neurons reestablish the same synapses to be able to recall the same memories. And there are a lot of animals that do remember, for example, where their food was stored, where they stored their food the winter before. Hummingbirds, their memory is really incredible, isn't it, Anusha?
How about hummingbirds, Anusha? Do they suffer any memory loss, or do they seem to function quite normally?
Sometimes they can use it almost every day, and they are known to remember really well where their food resources are. They don't have they're not like monogamous, and so the males, they don't pair for life or anything they don't pair at all, really. The males mate with the females and they leave, so they don't have a mate to remember. But they do have to remember where the flowers are, and they do seem to remember that across multiple days. I don't know if people have linked those two, torpor and memory, but in hummingbirds, but they have good memories and they use torpor often. We know those two separately.
Yeah, I wanted to say one other thing, which was that REM sleep, the dream state of sleep, is energetically quite costly. Your brain, the metabolism is skyrocketed. It's very, very high. And there is then a difference between brain temperature and the rest of your body. So it's possible that hypersleep could be a state of dreaming if you're able to suppress metabolism from the neck down, for example, and keep your brain active. It wouldn't save nearly as much energy as disconnecting the brain would be. But on the other hand, perhaps the advantage of that is you could do all the things that you do during dream sleep, which is, for example, creating new insights into tough problems. And maybe every time you rise out of your torpor or your hypersleep, you could gather in a new problem to solve when you're in the hypersleep state. Or you could mature, your emotional system matures and regulates. So it might be that you could work on all kinds of problems during that state if you could keep the brain in dreaming.
So Kelly mentioned earlier that perhaps the best model for human hibernation is from the bear. Are there any other models in the animal or insect world even that would be an indication of which way we should go to achieve hypersleep?
I'm just going to say my opinion is that looking at a variety of species and a variety of patterns of hibernation and torpor is, I think, going to be the most informing. So I think it's good to look at different species and different types of torpor.
Just in the last 2 years or so, there have been 2 or maybe 3 years, there have been a few papers on bats that found that they do something similar. They have a high body temperature because they're living in tropical regions with high outside air temperatures, but they can lower their metabolism or lower their heart rate and save energy even at those high temperatures. So it seems like they can do something like what the black bears are doing. And I just think we haven't studied it in enough species to know what many others do. Like people have started studying some species of hamsters, and this links to something both Gina and Kelly were talking about earlier, that like they might come out of torpor sleep deprived, it seems like, and they have to sleep for some time to kind of get rid of the sleep deprivation that they faced. So yeah, I think we'll learn different things by studying different animals, and we'll find we can synergize those findings and kind of achieve what we aim to do with hypersleep. Yeah.
There's a question that's in the comments here, saying from Stephanie Ann White, saying, "Can we learn anything from the unihemispheric sleep of dolphins?" I don't know if any of you can comment on that.
Yeah,
Let Gina take that one.
That's a fantastic question, and also whales and fur seals. They all have this unihemispheric sleep. Yeah, so that they can breathe, come to the surface and breathe even while they're sleeping, because one hemisphere can be in charge of swimming, looking out for predators, and bringing the animal to the surface so they can breathe. And what happens in the hemisphere that's asleep is that acetylcholine levels drop, and acetylcholine levels are really low during slow wave sleep. So yeah, so we could definitely learn. They also, whales and dolphins, they're swimming in cold waters, and they are homeotherms. Is that what they call them? So they need to regulate their temperature. So I think we should study them a lot more, figure out what's going on, to allow them to preserve their body temperature through sleep.
Yes.
Yeah, it is really interesting.
This business of reducing temperatures then as a way, even if it's a kind of a mild hypothermia, to get astronauts into hypersleep, in theory. Are there any other ideas around this? Is there anything about, say, using drugs or genetic treatments to trigger hypersleep? Is this something that's in the air?
Yes. So last year there were two really nice studies done in mice. So mice actually go into what's called fasting-induced torpor. I don't know if hummingbird torpor is induced by lack of food or they just have it as part of their circadian rhythm.
The mechanism changes depending on the time of the year. For migration,
okay,
they put on fat, and so even when they're fat, they can use torpor. But normally, there's some 4 to 6% fat threshold that triggers torpor entry, it seems like.
Okay. So anyway, in these mice, they've identified, or they've used genetic tools to selectively activate these cells that induce this fasting-induced torpor. And so, as technology advances, to be able to use those genetic manipulations in a therapeutic way, that could certainly be one aspect. And then with hibernation, with the non-traditional laboratory animals like the Arctic ground squirrel, we have many fewer genetic tools. And so most of that work has been focused more on drug development. And it's very different mechanism because it's not a response to lack of food. It's an evolved circadian rhythm that they just know when it's time to hibernate, and you can't stop them from hibernating. And understanding that rhythm and the chemicals that regulate that rhythm has inspired some drug development and discovery to try to mimic that in animals that don't normally hibernate.
Yeah, some people say one of the reason why we go into REM sleep is because we are testing the waters. Is it time to wake up yet? I don't think that that's a good one, but how do we know when to come out of hibernation? What is it? Is it just the passage of time? Is our brain keeping track of time?
That is a great question that nobody knows yet. And it, even these interbout arousals are fairly regularly timed. Apparently they can't really be called periodic though. But something is cueing the animal to, wake up, and they're very energetically expensive. So, so obviously they're important.
Shiver, right?
They shiver intensely. Yeah, they just, it's like their oxygen consumption just skyrockets and peaks as though that they were, running a marathon. Yeah,
it probably is miserable.
Cues that? They look miserable. They look horrible. They're a little grumpy when, but they're wild animals. They're not going to really be happy when they see where they are. But but it is very energetically expensive, and we don't know what cues it. And it has lots of benefits once they do wake up. It's hard to say which one is the most important. One of them is sleeping and creating, reestablishing synapses.
Yeah.
Perhaps I could ask a slightly left field question here, because I mean, is there evidence that early humans did hibernate? And I mention this because there was a story I read in The Guardian. I know it's not a scientific journal, but anyway, I read it in The Guardian, that there was a mass grave of Neanderthals found in northern Spain near Burgos. And according to that article, the scientists said that the pattern of lesions found in the human bones in this Sema cave are consistent with lesions found in the bones of hibernating mammals, including cave bears. And a strategy for hibernation would have been the only solution for these Neanderthals to survive, having to spend months in a cave due to frigid conditions. Is this fantastical, or do you think it's feasible that we once did hibernate, but we've lost the ability to do it?
I mean, it's possible, and it's hard to say. It's obviously going to be a little bit speculative based on those kinds of observations. But what else are you going to do? But that, to me, would have been a type of hibernation or torpor, more likely brought on by food shortage. But then there's that wonderful story about the Japanese man who was, I don't know if you've heard about this, but and I can't remember how long ago it was, but he was found after he was out in the cold for like about 3 weeks, and was found with a body temperature of 22 degrees C. Oof. And he was revived without neurologic injury. And apparently he had, multi-organ failure and other problems, but for the most part, the physicians describe it as a hibernating-like state. So maybe it is possible, and it is. I mean, and even if you look at yogis, some really experienced and practiced yogis can dramatically decrease their metabolic rate. And, so it's kind of consistent with what we know about hibernation, because it's very much driven by the parasympathetic nervous system.
This is coming up in the comments of if we could learn how to hypersleep here on Earth, what are the potential benefits of being able to do that?
I was thinking about this the other day. Wouldn't it be great if, say, 1/7 of the world's population could be put into hypersleep and not consuming energy and not warming the globe? So for a while, maybe every 7 years you put in for a year, or every week you put in for another week. I don't know, something.
And it delays aging, so you wouldn't you wouldn't be
There you go.
you could come back up and get back to life.
Skip all the Alaskan winters.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
Skip Alaskan winters.
This is great because you're all coming up with science fiction scenarios.
Well, I was thinking the problems with this is you'd have to first really trust the people putting you into hypersleep, right? Trust that they're not going to steal your house or, whatever during the time. And so who's in charge of who goes into hypersleep? And also, if you're not aging as fast while you're in hypersleep, then who gets to go into hypersleep together? Do you want your whole family to go in together so that everybody and all your friends, and then, which groups of friends, how well connected do you have to be to them? So, and, if you see your friend going into hypersleep without you, then, maybe they're not as good of friends as you thought because they chose to do this without you, and they don't care if you age while they're asleep. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting,
Yes.
And if the world goes on while you're in hypersleep state, people could die that are important to you, and you wouldn't know it, and you wouldn't until you came out. So
I think, Gina, you're really well in touch with the dark side of hypersleep here. This is something Molly Flatt in the comments is referring to, how it could be used for bad purposes. But do you think there could also be beneficial medical therapeutic uses for achieving hypersleep here?
What do you think?
I heard a slogan with the pandemic about hibernate for humanity. In the lockdown, just stay home and hibernate.
But that could be tricky because you suppress immune function when you're in hibernation. Like that seems to be one of the big reasons why bats are suffering from white nose syndrome, because the fungus affects them and they can't really combat it when they're hibernating. Wow. So I don't know if it could be a good response to the pandemic, but
Anusha, you mentioned something before we came on the other day about the benefits of decoupling temperature from metabolic rate, and I didn't really understand that. Is that something? Is that a good thing? How could we
Yes,
use that?
because that's exactly what Kelly was describing the black bears as doing. Like their body temperature is at 37 degrees Celsius, like she was saying, when they come out of hibernation, but they can keep their metabolism at 50% of its usual. So that means that usually when you're like a hummingbird is going into torpor, as its body temperature drops, its metabolism also drops. And it's kind of like a slowing down of everything as you get colder kind of thing. But if you can keep your body temperature high, there's less damage to your cells or something like that, for example. But if you can lower your metabolic rate somehow and just get rid of the processes that you don't really need right now,
Yes.
that could save energy while allowing you to stay at a high body temperature. So that is a good thing.
So a different kind of coma in a way is a way of protecting people whilst they're recovering from illness.
Right. I think there's stroke and cardiac patients in which they're trying to cool the body down because that is the best way of slowing things down and slowing damage down while the surgeons are performing the surgery, for example. But if you could, there's some limit right now to how cold you can make humans. It's about 18 degrees Celsius. So
Okay.
if we could figure out how to lower the metabolism so that there's less damage to the cells while they're doing their surgeries, but keep the body temperature high, that would be great. It's like an ideal solution.
Yes.
Right.
And Anusha and Kelly were both talking about sleep as being important for the immune system and hibernation being bad for that. And so, yeah, I think if you're talking about immune compromised state, even for medically induced coma, you would imagine that you would need sleep. You'd have to come out of that coma once in a while to make sure your immune system stays healthy. One of the reason why we don't know why animals die when they don't get any sleep, but they do eventually die. And it seems to be related to immune compromise because there are various systems that fail, but they all seem to be failing due to immune
Yeah.
loss. Yeah.
Well, from a medical perspective, it actually is good to inhibit inflammation. So,
Yeah.
Like after brain injury or whatnot, the anti-inflammatory influence of metabolic suppression and being cold is a benefit, but that's for more short term.
If you could all suspend disbelief for a moment and imagine yourself volunteering for a manned space flight to Mars, what would be your greatest concern as you climbed into your hypersleep pod? What would you be most worried about?
I think if we could do it like hibernating animals, there's nothing to worry about.
I think, what is it called? Gamma rays. Damaging chromosomes and all of that.
There was some talk, I've read bits here and there about perhaps the cooling process would protect you from gamma rays, cosmic rays. Do you think that's true?
I don't know. I know that chromatin remodeling happens during sleep. So I imagine that perhaps whatever damage is done in terms of high energy waves hitting your chromosomes could be repaired if you were able to sleep as you come out of hypersleep. Actually sleep.
Yeah.
It definitely needs more study. It's not real clear. Some studies show that the cooling will decrease the damage, but it's unknown what cooling does to DNA repair mechanisms and the whole process, and whether it just slows down or postpones the damage, or whether it can actually prevent it. But
there's a question here. How is from Carol Goodwin? How is hibernation mechanism related to estivation, where animals enter torpor due to hot temperature or lack of water, i.e., hot season rather than winter?
I just wrote this down because that's a very good question.
There's really very few people studying estivation. And so there haven't been a lot of, I'm not familiar with a lot of new literature there recently, but yeah, I don't know. And because they don't have the cold temperature to enhance the metabolic suppression? So it's a really good question.
Yes, it is a great question. And it brings me on to thinking about, I'm wondering about what difference it might make to the pace of research now that space exploration is now being propelled by, billionaires, with Elon Musk with SpaceX and Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin, maybe even Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic. Do you think this is going to bring more money into research?
I would hope so. I hope so. I really appreciate Spaceworks' effort and the progress they made in the theoretical application. And I hope that it will, because it's one of those things, the answers are out there. We just have to find them.
So what are the areas of research do you think that really need looking into?
Well, I mean, how to manipulate the physiology to mimic hibernation in a safe way for humans. I mean, the biggest risk right now is with the cardiovascular system that is adapted in hibernating animals, both for getting cold and also for downregulating without, one of the things in the Arctic ground squirrels is they resist, even as a species, they resist cerebral ischemia reperfusion. So they, so like when you slow their heart down and they have no blood flow, they don't mind. But a human would. And so things like that, we're not really adapted to be able to tolerate all the things that go with
And for me,
hibernation.
And for me, it would be memory, who you are, being able to, when you asked earlier, what would I worry about? I guess I would worry about waking up and not being myself again, not remembering key things that to me are part of who I am. So maybe waking up a different person. And, if I wake up a different person, I'm not going to miss who I was because I'm a different person, but that would be something to think about.
But it could also, those same things could be, a treatment for PTSD and other, mental health issues where it might be okay to not be so aware of some of those past experiences.
If you could selectively forget the things you want to forget. Yeah.
Right.
Like, that movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. You
right.
can use it. Yeah, I mean, I really like this idea of hypersleep, optimizing what sleep does and making us better. If we have to go into hypersleep for 500 years to get to whatever galaxy we want to go to, can we wake up knowing how to play the piano when we were just beginners at the time we started? Can we wake up? Can we program the computer to trigger our brain systems in the proper way, so we wake up knowing everything that we want to know?
I'm looking in the questions really cool. That are coming up, and Aaron Asok, there's a wondering, are there any key differences between a state of hibernation and a comatose state?
I would like to say that the comatose is pathology. It means things are not functioning. Hibernation is absolutely integrated physiology, completely fully functioning. So even though it's downregulation and shutting off of some systems, it's well orchestrated and completely well controlled.
Yes. And similarly with induced coma, that's fundamentally different because usually somebody's seriously ill.
Yeah.
So, and can you glean anything from how humans respond to induced comas, to how they'd respond to hypersleep?
Well, the mechanism of induced coma is, really through sedation. And sedation is not really a metabolic downregulation. So it's different. It's not as specific as turning down metabolism.
Yeah, and anesthetics themselves are not at all like sleep, the state of anesthesia. For example, our memories are not served by anesthesia. But I guess if you're putting someone in a medically induced coma, you're not worried so much about specific memories because you're just trying to save their life in general. But yeah, that is something we haven't really studied enough in people who either a medically induced coma or spontaneous or injury related coma is, because with people, you don't want to do it lightly. You don't want to say, hey, we're going to give you stuff to learn, and then we're going to wake you up out of a coma and see how well you consolidated it. But from the studies of anesthesia that have done, anesthesia is not good for learning and memory. In fact, it's bad for it. And when people wake up out of anesthetized or comatose states, there's often post-anesthesia delirium, and that happens worse when you get older. Why is that? We don't know. But
and none of these states save energy, right? Which is what the point of hypersleep, if you're trying to do it for space travel, for example, is.
Yeah.
There's a question here from Ritika Mukherjee, which I don't quite understand, but I'm sure you guys will. Are there any interoceptive links, apart from fasting conditions, between torpor and general metabolic state? Perhaps some learnings from disorders in the animals studied?
I was just invited to talk about chronic fatigue syndrome and to relate what we see in hibernation with some of the interoceptive cues, that relate to motivation and ability to, get up and do stuff. But, with the hibernating animal, we look at it more really as an enhancement of sleep drive. So I'm not entirely sure how it relates.
And another question from Stephanie Ann White. Can we learn anything? Oh, no, sorry, we've had that one. Omar Sharon, are there any electrophysiological recordings from torpor? Do you see SWA, spindles, etc.?
So basically, most of it has been cortical. And as they cool, it's just slow wave sleep, and it just, goes away, to where a hibernating Arctic ground squirrel at a body temperature or brain temperature near 2 degrees C is just flatline.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's incredible that you can go from that back to sleep and back to waking, remembering, same person. It's really amazing.
Yes, I think that would be my main concern. Going into hypersleep, fine. I can see that working. It's what happens when you try to get out of it. I think that would be my main worry. Yeah. There's a question here from Rosalind Francis. Have you seen anything in popular films that you feel get wrong about the portrayal of hypersleep?
That's a great question.
I suppose it is.
They solve all the problems that we're talking about, first of all. So that would be something. I don't know. What do you think, Kelly or Anusha?
I mean, they're generally, the idea is that they go to sleep for a very long time and they don't do these little interbout arousals. And so it's not really clear. It's usually the movies suggest they're very cold. And so to me, that's the biggest thing that isn't, consistent with what I know from natural hibernation.
I think there's so many interpretations, it's hard to tell. Like there's the Dust series by Hugh Howey, where people are underground in silos and they're put in these hibernation states again for centuries sometimes, and they're on rotation to come out and like man the whole silo while the others are in this hibernation kind of state. But there's others where like people are deflated and then they're puffed back up while they I don't
see that one.
Vacuum packed.
So there was one science fiction young adult novel that my graduate student was telling me about, where one of the people supposed to be in hypersleep for 500 years woke up but was still paralyzed for the entire trip. So 500 years, and they ended up being the bad guy in the story. But so what were they thinking, and how awful that would be to be conscious and unable to move for that long without any new information coming, no one to talk to.
I'd become a bad guy too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you think yourselves, from all your studies, think that it's possible? It's not entirely fanciful, is it, that humans might be able to adopt some kind of low temperature hibernation to allow hypersleep. I mean, do you think it is possible, or do you think the holdup might be that we'll have to test this on someone, test it on a human?
But that's often done at like in medical research. People have to do it just to save humans, and so they have to cool humans down. And so there are, I think, many situations where you could start to test it out and see what the effects are of cooling humans down. Kelly.
We are working in that direction. So it depends on which day you ask me, how the results are looking. But I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to translate what we've learned in ground squirrels to humans. And so we've, done a lot of testing in rats. We've done some testing in pigs. And I've been working with the University of Pittsburgh, who has a human cooling lab. And they're experts. They're affiliated with the emergency department, and so they cool people all the time for critical care. But and so we'll see. It's a matter of showing the FDA that it's safe enough, and so we'll see how far we go.
There's a disorder called Klein-Levin syndrome. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but that's as probably close to hibernation as humans get. It's a disorder. Thankfully, it goes away, but it takes about, I think, 10 years before. And what it is, it's a hypersleep kind of situation where people are asleep for 23.5 hours every day, and they can't be awakened. And I don't know how much energy they're saving. I don't know how many studies there are. It's thankfully a rare disorder, but when they do wake up for that half hour a day, they are hyperphagic. They will eat anything, and they're not really awake in the sense that, you can't have a conversation and say, oh, and they aren't aware of their situation, but they will eat anything that they can see and then crawl back into bed. It's an interesting situation.
That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
No. Well, that might indicate that there's a genetic
something we can do. Yeah.
And then find a way of switching that off. Switching it on and switching it off. Just like
yeah. I mean, like what they're doing with the mice. They're able to selectively with genetic tools activate or inhibit that particular cell group, and they're able to induce torpor that way.
And in terms of human testings, perhaps at the end of the day, we'll need the equivalent of Air Force test pilots who are willing to actually try out hypersleep full on. They're the bravest people, I suppose, when it comes to aerospace. So
maybe those who would want to do it would be those who would like to escape their life anyway. Right. And if you could make hypersleep a functional time when you could actually improve, for example, PTSD or anxiety or depression or regrow limbs or, something like that, then maybe you would get a lot more volunteers for that, because there are a lot of people who have problems that make life really less worth living. So
that's great. Well, that's a really positive note to perhaps bring the discussion to a close. It's been fascinating, and I hope everybody who's been watching and listening in has really enjoyed it. And I expect to see you all writing science fiction short stories from now.
We'll give you ideas.
Yeah.
They'll be very dark coming from Gina, I think.
Thank you so much. I mean, honestly, it was utterly fascinating, and I could happily listen to you for another hour or so. But thank you to Anne, Gina, Kelly, and Anusha for taking us on this whirlwind tour of hypersleep. We have recorded the webinar, and it will be up and available on YouTube directly afterwards. So if you missed the beginning, you can always catch up. Don't forget, you can find out more about Ada Lovelace Day on findingada.com, and you can follow us on Facebook at Ada Lovelace Day and on Twitter and YouTube at Finding Ada. So I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers once again for a fantastic webinar. Thank you for celebrating Ada Lovelace Day with us.
Thank you for having us. Nice to meet you all.
Our pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.